In this video, we're going to review midpoint, and we're also going to review B-box. So to start with, we're going to start with midpoint. So the midpoint would be like if we had a line segment that has two endpoints. The midpoint would be the point that was directly in the center. Algebraically, we can find the midpoint by knowing the midpoint formula, which is a formula that you're going to have memorized for your EOC. So your midpoint formula would be x plus x divided by 2 and y plus y divided by 2. So the x's and the y's in your formula come from your two endpoints. So you've got an endpoint here that's an xy and an endpoint here that's an xy. So to find the point that's in the center of them, you basically take the average of those 2 points. So you add them together, divide by 2. Because your midpoint is a point, it's important that you represent it with parentheses and separated by a comma so that you know which part represents your x of the coordinate and which part represents your y of the coordinate. So on the first example, it says find the midpoint of the line segment that has endpoints at 519 and 1, 1. So I recommend anytime that you are doing a midpoint problem that you draw yourself a line segment. And label it so that you've got your two endpoints and then your midpoint in the center. So it says that you're trying to find the midpoint, so you need to know what this is, but you've got the endpoints at 5, 19, and 1, 1. And it really doesn't matter the order that you put them in, you'll be able to get the correct answer regardless of whether or not you put 1, 1 here and 5, 19 here. Okay, so for this one, you're going to need to know the algebraic formula. So we reviewed what the algebraic formula was for midpoint, and that would be parenthesis x plus x divided by 2 and then y plus y divided by 2. It's important that you separate them with the comma because the midpoint represents a point that is on the graph. So each of your endpoints have an x and a y, and so then you would just plug them in. So you would have 5 plus 1 divided by 2 and 19 plus 1 divided by 2. 5 plus 1 would give you 6 divided by 2, and 19 plus 1 would give you 20 divided by 2. So then you can reduce those fractions so that you've got 6 divided by 2, which gives you 3, and 20 divided by 2, which gives you 10. So your midpoint for this particular problem would be 3, 10. Find the midpoint of a line segment with endpoints at -6, -9, and 7, 12. So to begin, we'll draw our line segment. There are endpoints, and in the center is our midpoint. So it tells us that we're given two endpoints, one at -6, -9, and the other at 7, 12, and we need to find the midpoint. So we're going to use our midpoint formula, which is parenthesis x plus x divided by 2, comma, y plus y divided by 2. The x's and y's come from your endpoints, so you've got an x and a y, an x and a y, and so you'll just plug in the x's where they go and the y's where they go. So you would say -6 plus 7 divided by 2 and -9 plus 12 divided by 2. -6 plus 7 gives you +1 divided by 2, and -9 plus 12 gives you +3 divided by 2. Because I can't reduce either of those fractions, I would leave them just like that. You could also see it, though, written as a decimal. So 1 over 2 is the same as 0.5, and 3 over 2 is the same as 1 1/2. so 1.5. Either way is correct. The next example says find the missing endpoint of a line segment with a midpoint at 8:10 and one endpoint at 12:12. So when we draw our line segment for this particular problem, we'll notice that what we're given in the problem is different than what we've been given in the other examples. So this one says find the missing endpoint of a line segment with a midpoint at 8:10. So now, instead of looking for the midpoint, we're given the midpoint at 8:10, and it gives us another endpoint at 12:12. So what we're trying to do is figure out what this endpoint over here would be. So what that means is we can look just at the x values and say 12 plus some number gave me 8. So if I think about 12 plus some number gives me 8, the only number I could come up with to give me 8 if I were adding it to 12 would be -4. So what I would do to get my endpoint over here is I would say, okay, 8 plus -4 gives me some value. So 8 plus -4 would be the same as 8 minus 4, which would give me 4. So my x for the endpoint, the other endpoint, is going to be 4. All right, I can do the same thing with the y's. So I would say 12 plus some number gives me 10. So 12 plus -2 gives me 10. So then I can go from my midpoint, and I'm going to do the y. So 10 plus -2 gives me some number. So 10 plus -2 would give me 8. So that would make my missing endpoint at 4, 8. I could check my work by doing the midpoint formula. So the midpoint formula would take my two endpoints and say 12 plus 4 divided by 2, and then 12 plus 8 divided by 2. Well, 12 plus 4 is 16 divided by 2, and 12 plus 8 is 20 divided by 2. 16 divided by 2 gives you 8, and 20 divided by 2 gives you 10. So because this matched my midpoint, that means I must have done this part correct. All right, find the missing endpoint of the line segment with a midpoint at -7,3 and one endpoint at -7,15. So I draw my line segment, and I know I'm going to have endpoints and then a midpoint. It says I'm finding an endpoint. It's got a midpoint at -7,3 and another endpoint at -7,15. And I need to find this missing endpoint. So what I'm going to do is, I know the midpoint is the point that's directly in the center of these 2 points. So if I can figure out how much distance is between this point and this point, I can go from this point and add whatever the distance was here between the x's and y's to get this point. So I'm going to start with the x's for this endpoint. And I would say -7 plus some distance gets me to -7. Well, -7 plus 0 would get me to -7. So what I'll do is, from this midpoint, I would say -7 plus whatever my distance was between -7 and -7, which was 0, and that'll give me the x for this missing endpoint. So -7 plus 0 gives me -7. All right, I would do the same thing for the y's. So between this y value and this y value, there's a certain distance. So I would say 15 plus some value equals 3. So I have to figure out what would be the distance between 15 and 3. So if I'm at 15 and I need to get to 3, I would go backwards 12 spaces, so -12. Now, Because this is the midpoint, the distance between -7, 15 and -7, 3 should be the same. So, as it is between -7, 3 and this missing endpoint. So what I'm going to do is go from the midpoint, which is 3, and I'm going to add to it the distance that I calculated here, which is -12, and that will give me -9. So that tells me that my missing endpoint is at -7, -9. So I can check my work by doing the midpoint formula. So doing the endpoints, -7 plus -7 divided by 2, and then 15 plus -9 divided by 2. So you would say -7 plus -7, which is -14 divided by 2, and then 15 plus -9, which would give you +6 divided by 2. So -14 divided by 2 is -7, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. Because what we found is the midpoint algebraically matched the midpoint that was given to us in the problem, that means that we must have done our work here correctly. Find the missing endpoint of a line segment with a midpoint at 6, -2, and one endpoint at 3, 5. So I've drawn my line segment with my 2 endpoints and then my midpoint being in the center. So it tells me that my midpoint is at 6, -2, and I have one endpoint at 3, 5. I can find this missing endpoint by saying that the distance between 3, 5 and 6, -2 has to be the same as the distance between 6, -2 and whatever this endpoint is. So I would basically be saying 3 plus some distance gets me to 6. So the distance between 3 and 6, if I start at 3, is +3. So then that means that the distance between this 6 and this x value has to be 3 as well. So I would say 6 plus 3 gets me to 9. So this endpoint has an x value that is 9. I can do the same thing for the y's. So the distance between 5 and -2 needs to be the same as the distance between -2 and whatever this point is. So I would say I'm starting at 5, I'm going to add some distance, and it will get me to -2. So to start at 5 and get to -2, you've got to go backwards 7 spaces, so -7. If I'm at -2, I have to add that distance of -7 so that this distance here will match this distance here. So -2 plus -7 gives you -9. So that makes your missing endpoint 9, -9. You can check your answer by taking your 2 endpoints, doing the midpoint formula, and checking to make sure that it matches the midpoint that was given to us in the problem. So we would do 3 plus 9 divided by 2, and then 5 plus -9 divided by 2. So 3 plus 9 gives you 12 divided by 2, and 5 plus -9 gives you -4 divided by 2. So you would say 12 divided by 2 gives you 6, and -4 divided by 2 gives you -2. So because this midpoint that I calculated algebraically matched the one that was given to me in the problem, that means that I must have done this work correctly. Next, we're going to talk about a little bit about linear equations, and we're going to talk specifically about the B box. So whenever you write a linear equation, you should write it in the form y equals mx plus b. So we can easily calculate what the m is by knowing what the slope formula is. And the slope formula is y minus y over x minus x. Well, the x and y that are in your linear equation are always going to stay x and y unless you're plugging in a specific point. What's maybe more difficult to find is the b. So remember that in your linear equation, your m represents the slope and your b represents the y-intercept. So when you're missing b and they don't tell you what it's supposed to be, you'll need to do the b box. So the b box is just a fancy way for us to find what b is. So the b box is going to look like all of the pieces of the linear y equals mx plus b, just written down in a line. So m equals, b equals, x equals, y equals, and then at the bottom, you'll be able to find your new equation. So all of this is in a box, and that's why we call it the B box. So you'll be given M, you'll be given x and y because you'll be given a point, and you'll have to find out what B is. Once you figure out what B is and you've got your M and your B, you can mark out x and y, and that will help you to write your new equation that will look like y equals mx plus b. So number 1 says write the equation of a line with a slope of 8 that passes through the point 0, 5. So because we have to write the equation of a line, we know it's going to eventually look like y equals mx plus b. So in our problem, it tells us what the m is going to be, but it doesn't tell us what the b is going to be. So I'm going to go over to the side and do my b box. So I've got m, b, x, and y, and at the bottom, I'll get my new equation. So the m they tell me in the problem is 8. It says that it's going to pass through this specific point. Well, any point always has an x and a y. So I'll take my x and y and plug them in where they go in my b box. So I'll have 0 and 5. So remember, you're not going to have anything for b. That's what you're trying to figure out. So what you're going to do now is go back to y equals mx plus b and plug in the numbers that you've got in your b box. So for y, you're going to plug in 5. For m, you're going to plug in 8. For x, you're going to plug in 0. And for b, you're just going to say plus b. So you'll have 5 equals 8 times 0, which is 0, plus b. But that 0 is not necessary, so we just say 5 equals b. So once I plug in my 5 for b, I can cross out x and y and make my new equation, which is going to look like y equals mx plus b, by saying y equals m x plus 5. Number 2 says write the equation of the line that passes through the points 5, 7, and 3, negative 7. So this particular one asks us to write the equation of a line, which means y equals mx plus b, but it doesn't give us what the m is. We can easily find the m, though, by doing our y minus y over x minus x, which is our slope formula that you have to have memorized for the EOC. And you can find your slope by using the points that are given to you. So you've got an x and a y in each of the points, and it doesn't matter which one you start with. So I'm going to start with 7. So if I do 7, I would do 7 minus, because there's a minus there, and then a negative 7. So 7 minus negative 7 over. If I go with 7 as my first y, 5 has to be my first x. So 5 minus 3. So I would say 7 minus negative 7 really means 7 plus positive 7. So that would be 14 over 5 minus 3, which is 2, which means that my slope is going to be 7, because 14 divided by 2 is 7. Now that I've got my m, now I can move on and do my b box because I'm still missing what b is. So I would say m equals 7, don't know what b is. X and y are going to be from one of these points, and it doesn't matter which one you choose. And then at the bottom, you'll get your new equation. So you can skip the b because you don't know what that is. You're going to figure that out. X and y are going to come from one of these points. I'm going to go with the 5, 7 point. It doesn't matter, though. You could do 3 and negative 7 if you wanted to. So if I go with 5, 7, that means my x is 5 and my y is 7. So when I go do y equals mx plus b and I plug everything in, I would have 7 equals 7 times 5 plus b. So that would be 7 equals 35 plus b. And then I would just solve for b. So I would subtract 35 from both sides, and I would have 7 minus 35. 7 minus 35 would give me negative 28. So I would have negative 28 equals b. So once I get b, I can mark out x and y, and my new equation would look like y equals 7x minus 28. Number 3 asks us to write the equation of a line that is parallel to the line y equals negative 3x plus 7 and passes through the point negative 1, 1. So this one asks me to write the equation of a line, so that's y equals mx plus b. It tells me that it has to be parallel to y equals negative 3x plus 7. I remember that parallel means that it has to have the same slope. So that means that the m is going to have to be the same in my new equation as it is in my old equation. So that means when I go to do the b box, because it doesn't tell me what b is, it just gives me a point, that tells me that I'm going to have to say m is equal to negative 3. So then I don't know what b is, but I can figure out what x and y are because they give me a point. Each point always has an x and then a y, so that means x is negative 1 and y is positive 1. In the end, I'll get my new equation. So I don't know what b is. I've got all the rest of them. I can plug them into y equals mx plus b. So I would have 1 equals negative 3 times negative 1 plus b. So that would be 1 equals negative 3 times negative 1 is positive 3 plus b. And I can solve for b by subtracting 3 from both sides. When I do that, the 3's here will cancel, and I would say 1 minus 3 gives me negative 2. So negative 2 equals b. I can mark out my x and y, and my new equation is y equals negative 3x minus 2. And the last one says, write the equation of a line that is perpendicular to y equals negative 3x plus 7 and passes through the point 3, positive 1. So I'm writing the equation of a line, which means y equals mx plus b. I need it to be perpendicular to y equals negative 3x plus 7. So what that means is the original slope is negative 3. But I know for it to be perpendicular, that means it's going to have to be the opposite reciprocal of negative 3. So that means that my new m is going to have to be opposite, which means if this one's negative, this one's positive. Reciprocal means that I take the fraction and I flip it. 3 is not written as a fraction right now, but I know that any number, any whole number, is always going to be 3 over 1 if I want to write it as a fraction, which means that when I take the reciprocal of it, I just flip it. So that's going to make it positive 1 over 3. So opposite reciprocal is what I have whenever I have perpendicular, and I'm going to have the different signs. That's the opposite part. Reciprocal means flip this fraction, so 1 over 3. All right, b is something that I don't know, but I can figure out x and y because it does give me a point. So x is my 3 and y is 1. And at the end, I'll get my new equation. So I go back to y equals mx plus b and plug in all the numbers that I have. So I've got y is 1, m is 1/3, x is 3 plus b. So I can say I need to do 1/3 times 3. So I can say 1 over 3 times 3 over 1, which would give me 1 equals 1 times 3, which is 3, over 3 over 3 times 1, which is 3. So I would have 3 over 3. Well, that's the same thing as 1. So I would have 1 equals 1 plus b. To get b by itself, I would subtract 1 from each side. Those would cancel, and so would these. So that would give me 0 equals b. So I can mark out my x and y now that I've got b filled in, and I can write my new equation. So when I write my new equation, because my b is equal to 0, I could either write it as y equals 1/3 x plus 0, or you're more likely to see y equals 1/3 x.
Good morning, everyone. If I can have your attention, please. The bell rings.